Should we be worried about democracy in the United Kingdom? This is a question that's getting asked increasingly at the moment. People from diverse perspectives, different political outlooks are starting to question whether there are things going on in our system of government that threaten democracy itself. And while there are lots of dimensions to that story, a lot of the focus is on the Conservative government of Boris Johnson that currently holds office. To give you some examples, in October last year, Lord Putnam, retiring from the House of Lords, where he had sat as a Labour peer, made a speech in which he raised concerns about the prospects for democracy in the UK. Putnam described the Conservative government under Johnson as setting out to chip away at and undermine much of what defines an active liberal democracy. Those institutions that might act as checks and balances on a populist government that's trampling on long-held rights and conventions with the sole purpose of tightening its own grip on power. Putnam, as I suggested, is not alone in harbouring and expressing these kind of concerns, and they're shared by others from different political perspectives, different political backgrounds. For instance, the former Conservative Prime Minister John Major, who spoke at the Institute for Government last month in February 2022. Major warned that we are living through a time of uncertainty and political turbulence at home and overseas. At home, we take democracy for granted. We should not. It is far more complex than simply having the right to vote. In many countries, there is a widespread discontent of the governed, and democracy is in retreat, nor is it in a state of grace in the UK. So should we be worried? To approach this question, it's worth noting that pessimism about the future prospects for UK democracy is a recurring phenomenon. In fact, long before democracy, as we would reasonably interpret it today, had even fully been established, commentators were saying that it was in trouble. As long ago as 1891, in his essay The Soul of Man Under Socialism, Oscar Wilde wrote that high hopes were once formed of democracy, but democracy simply means the bludgeoning of the people by the people for the people. It has been found out. Moving on a bit, to give another example, in 1929, Lord Hewitt, the Lord Chief Justice of England, in a book called The New Despotism, warned of the executive taking on oppressive power through the use of delegated legislation. Hewitt described a system, the objective of which was to subordinate Parliament, to evade the courts, and to render the will or the caprice of the executive unfettered and supreme. The pessimism continued. In his 1944 work, The Road to Serfdom, concerned about trends in the socio-economic role of government, Friedrich Hayek held that a democracy which embarks on planning progressively relinquishes its powers. When it becomes dominated by a collectivist creed, democracy will inevitably destroy itself. One discussion we hear a lot about democracy and threats to it today involves the role of a particular communications technology, the internet and the social media that operate on the internet, and whether that might be helping or hindering democracy. This kind of debate has precursors as well, but has focused on earlier technologies such as radio and television. The Committee on Broadcasting, chaired by Lord Beveridge, William Beveridge, found in its 1951 report that broadcasting is capable of increasing perhaps the most serious of all dangers which threaten democracy and free institutions today, the danger of passivity, of acceptance by masses of orders given to them and of things said to them. Coming from a different perspective again, in a recording released the following year called There Are Bad Times Just Around the Corner, Noel Coward sang, "It's as clear as crystal from Bridlington to Bristol that we can't save democracy and we don't much care. If the Reds and the Pinks believe that England stinks and that world revolution is bound to spread, we'd better all learn the lyrics of the old red flag and wait until we drop down dead." So there, Coward was singing to comedic effect, but there's some seriousness in there as well, about an external threat coming from the communist ideology, coming from the East, coming from the Soviet Union. Another perspective of what might be a problem for democracy. Moving on to the next decade, in 1968, Tony Benn, a Labour MP and minister at the time, spoke, prompted partly by the wave of international protest movements which were then current. He talked about discontent expressing itself in despairing apathy or violent protest, and that it might engulf us all in bloodshed. Ben went on, "It is no good saying that it could never happen here. It could. Beyond parliamentary democracy as we know it, we shall have to find a new popular democracy to replace it." The following decade, the 1970s, saw a lot of concern about how democracy might be undermined, both from the left and from the right of the spectrum. In 1976, writing from a social democratic standpoint, Stephen Haseler published a book called The Death of British Democracy, while in the same year, the senior Conservative politician, Lord Hailsham, famously spoke of an elective dictatorship. Hailsham cautioned that this nation has moved towards a totalitarianism which can only be altered by a systematic and radical overhaul of our constitution. In 1978, another Conservative, William Waldegrave, warned of capture of the executive by a totalitarian clique which would subsequently impose its intellectually disreputable certainties at the barrel of a gun. Another future MP and minister, this time Labour, Chris Mullin, speculated in the 1982 novel of the same name about a very British coup against a left-wing government. These kind of concerns in various forms from various standpoints continued. By the early 21st century, there was concern about falling levels of public participation in politics. This kind of worry prompted the instigation of the Power Inquiry, a civil society exercise. The Power Inquiry reported in 2006, expressing fear regarding the rise of undemocratic forces. And as well as being worried about political extremism taking hold, the Power Inquiry was also concerned about what it described as a gradual growth of quiet authoritarianism in Britain, where policy and law is made in consultation with a small coterie of supporters and with little reference to wider views and interests. We can see then that claims that democracy in the UK is in peril have recurred frequently. We can also see that the UK has not yet suffered a major reversal of the type seen, for instance, in Germany in the 1930s. But does that mean that all those voicing concerns, perceiving threats, were necessarily mistaken, and by extension, should we be tempted to dismiss the concerns that we hear about today? I would argue not. And it might be that the very persistent caution and vigilance that we've seen is a source of resilience. Because people are willing to identify problems as they appear, it makes it more possible to resist them. So that really takes us back to our question again. Should we be worried about democracy in the United Kingdom today? Well, what are the challenges and how serious are they? To start with, I should say what I mean by democracy. I define it as entailing inclusive and consistent governance, both as a principle and a practice. In other words, I mean governance that involves people and institutions as widely as possible in deciding who should hold power and what they should do. And at the same time, in doing that, it follows rules, it sticks to certain principles, it acts in a way which is to some extent predictable and is subject to the rule of law and adheres to things like human rights principles. So it's this combination of involving people, the inclusiveness, but being consistent, the rule of law idea that goes to make up democracy. Tendencies and initiatives that are in some way to those qualities, I would say, comprise threats of some kind or certainly can serve to undermine democracy, can be counter-democratic in nature. So how much of this counter-democratic kind of manifestation is taking place today? One thing to look at, which is important when we consider that question, is the highly disruptive and divisive prolonged episode that's known as Brexit. We saw the referendum in 2016, which produced a leave result, as we know, where 52% roughly of those who took part voted to leave the European Union. This vote and its aftermath have really produced a shock for the system, which in some ways I think has destabilised it. It's affected both popular and elite levels within the UK democratic system. The campaign itself in the referendum was a subject of controversy, centering on subjects such as alleged disinformation and the misuse of personal data for online campaigning. The implementation of Brexit presented challenges to a variety of institutions in the Constitution and the way in which they interacted with each other and the values that applied to them. Brexit also raised similar questions about what the UK system should look like after the UK had actually departed the European Union. And some of those questions are still being played out today. The Brexit experience as a whole also helped generate what we might call a populist narrative. According to this narrative, the will of the people, which could be defined in a sense which excluded certain groups, such as those who were not British citizens, had expressed itself through the referendum. And this will, according to this narrative, had to be realised in the face of resistance from domestic elites, judges, civil servants, politicians, perhaps the media, those kind of groups, who also, according to this narrative, colluding surreptitiously with a supranational organisation, the European Union. And between them, they were working to frustrate the will of the people. That's a kind of narrative which developed and which we can see as having fitting clearly in what might be termed the populist mould. Connected to this, the Brexit episode also produced a significant change in the power balance within the governing Conservative Party and brought a particular individual Boris Johnson to the premiership. By that development, arguably the Conservative Party and the government themselves became populist in character. So, what is the actual democratic record and the democratic prospects for this government, this Johnson government? An initiative I've been involved with, the United Kingdom Constitution Monitoring Group, has actually taken on the task of assessing democratic developments against a set of values that it has identified. We're producing a report every 6 months called The Constitution in Review, the second edition of which appeared in February this year, February 2022, covering the last 6 months of 2021. I'm going to talk a bit now about some of the issues that the Constitution in Review reports have raised, which can be seen as democratically difficult. And I'm also going to elaborate upon that list, and I'm going to indicate where it's me talking rather than the monitoring group. An overall theme that the United Kingdom Constitution Monitoring Group, the UKCMG, has identified is that of growing arbitrary power for the UK executive. The old traditional mechanisms of self-regulation that have applied, such as those we can find in the ministerial code, have proved ineffective in important cases. We've also seen the UK government, the UK executive, take steps to try and limit the more formal constraints rather than those self-regulation measures, the more formal, perhaps even legal constraints that apply to it. And in the process, actively try to expand the discretionary authority it possesses. So that's a problem from a democratic point of view, an executive that's perhaps taking on too much power and gaining too much flexibility. There are also problems we've noted within the UK executive in the failure to uphold standards and integrity. There's a lot of evidence of unethical and unlawful behaviour, and also signs of a lack of financial propriety being adhered to. There's been, for example, cases of poor practice in the awarding of government contracts and in the soliciting of donations, and also been a perception or perhaps a reality of conflicts of interests. There have also been examples simply of poor conduct by people in public office. We've seen a pressure upon the maintenance of the values of the civil service. For instance, there have been multiple departures, abrupt departures by senior officials from their posts. And there have also been difficulties appearing with the systems that are designed to maintain standards in Whitehall. There's been evidence of intense efforts by ministers to influence processes for the making of major public appointments and perhaps steer them in an increasingly partisan direction. The government also has legislative plans to change the electoral system in certain ways that are problematic, including potentially reducing the autonomy of the Electoral Commission, a body which is charged with overseeing good practice not only in the conduct of elections, which is important, but also in party financing. In 2021, the government famously induced the House of Commons to vote to compromise its own mechanisms for the upholding of standards amongst MPs. And that was a problematic enough act in itself, but the way it went about it was through heavy whipping, and perhaps whipping of MPs, disciplining of MPs that went beyond what was proper for in terms of the role of a whip. Now, this act in some ways backfired on the government, created a lot of negative response and caused it to take a different approach, but nonetheless very problematic from a democratic point of view. We've seen, and we had already seen by the time of the report published last month, but there's growing concerns in this area, evidence of improper practice in appointments to the House of Lords, in who the Prime Minister is recommending to be placed in the second chamber of Parliament. There's been excessive discretionary authority vested in ministers through the creation and heavy deployment of delegated lawmaking powers. As we've seen, this is an issue raised long ago in the context of the supposed new despotism, but it's something that's very much come back on the agenda recently. There's a general lack of honesty and responsibility in UK government communications, including from the Prime Minister, both within and outside Parliament. I'd add here my own extension upon that hasn't specifically appeared in a UK CMG publication, that the UK government's behaved in a way that might be seen as intended to intimidate the British Broadcasting Corporation, including threatening its funding basis, possibly to discourage the corporation from producing current affairs content that scrutinises the government in ways that ministers don't like. I'd also add again myself that there's a lot of evidence of problematically close associations between the government and some sections of the media and journalists. Back to things the UK CMG has specifically identified, there has been an undermining of the position of the devolved institutions relative to the UK level of governance. And a lot of that has been tied up with how do we establish this post-Brexit power balance between the different levels of government within the UK, managing these powers which have been brought back from the EU after leaving. There have been attempts to restrict certain human rights, such as the right to protest, the right to demonstrate. There has been a disregard for international law and treaty commitments, perhaps most obviously through the way the government has behaved with respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol of the EU exit agreement, and also the attitude it's taken towards its obligations regarding the treatment of refugees. The government has shown interest in reducing the scope of the courts effectively to review the actions of the executive, and also in the possibility of diluting human rights protection in UK law. Finally, the UK government is approaching the whole idea of constitutional change in a way that doesn't seem to have regard to the desirability of getting consensus for such change. It seems to be more interested in driving what it wants through and not taking into account other views. So all of these things, and there are others, but there's a fairly long selection there, are problems. Now, not all of them are wholly new problems. As we've seen, some of these issues been raised in different ways at different times for different reasons by different people. The government also has not necessarily driven all these things through yet. Some of them have met with resistance, for instance, from the House of Lords. But the simultaneous combination of such a range of issues in such intense form is unusual. Taken as a whole, these and other difficulties do comprise a serious source of concern about democracy in the UK. They may or may not prefigure a more serious deterioration. But regardless of the ultimate outcome, they already amount to a substantial and regrettable tendency towards counter-democracy. We should also consider these threats in the wider international context. Scholars of democratic development identify what they term historic waves of democratization. These are historic periods during which countries in different parts of the world have become increasingly democratic, broadly in parallel to each other. The most recent wave of this type, often regarded as the third historic wave, began in the early to mid-1970s when Portugal, Greece and Spain moved away from dictatorship. And this third wave then spread to other parts of the world in the decades that followed. But each wave has been followed by a period of democratic reversal. And right now, we seem to be in just such a period that's possibly been stretching back for well over a decade. This particular phase of democratic regression or counter-democracy has affected not only relatively new and less established democracies, but also the more established democracies, the so-called mature democracies. They include, for instance, the United States and the UK itself. So difficulties experienced by the UK at the moment can be understood in this light. Also, alongside these difficulties for emerging and established democracies, we've seen the more authoritarian regimes persisting, carrying on being authoritarian, not reforming. We've also seen that those kind of regimes are able actively to work to undermine democratic states. This tendency includes, but is not confined to, Russia. So this idea of the broader international trend towards or away from democracy, combined with the threats from outside, are both important factors to take into account. They serve to emphasize further that we should take present difficulties seriously. They are part of a wider tendency that makes them all the more real and suggests how high the stakes could be. This international context obviously calls into question ideas about UK exceptionality, showing that in fact the UK is party to wider patterns. It suggests that the UK is part of a shared experience, and perhaps that supporters of democracy in different parts of the world should cooperate more fully to promote their cause. An honest recognition and appraisal of the vulnerabilities of democracy in the UK as elsewhere could be a first step to making democracy more resilient. And the historic patterns suggest that democratic downturns need not be permanent. A further wave of democratisation, including the UK within it, might be attainable.